Welcome back to Walking Away from Arcadia. I am Simon, and our other host, Victor, is here as well. And today we have our first guest for our discussion topic, queer themes in Changeling the Dreaming. And our guest today is Erika. And go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Erica. I have been playing World of Darkness for quite some time. However, I wasn't really in a position to play Changeling until I met Simon a couple years ago, and I really dug into it because he helped me to understand it through his eyes. And I read a bunch of the books in the last 2 years, and I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Thank you very much for
hmm
being on the show. It's nice to have a broader perspective, especially for a theme like this one.
Absolutely, I'm excited to be here.
So, diving into queer themes in Changeling, this is something Simon and I talked about a little bit in our first episode. For the two of us, we've talked about this a lot. We think there are a lot of parallels between the way changelings work and the way we've seen a lot of the queer community. Queer is a big umbrella. It includes a lot of stuff. Certainly our experience, both being gay men and from conversations we've had with people from other parts of the community. I guess, where would you really want to start, Simon? There are so many different sort of overlapping, interesting similarities.
So, like we discussed previously, there's a lot of material to dig into with the chimerical reality, mundane reality dichotomy for hidden minorities. So, like with gay men, lesbians, people who, this is a loaded term, but people who pass as a majority member, whether through active work on their part or just because it's hard to identify certain minorities as being minorities. And like Victor and I have both talked about this from our perspective before, and it'd be good to get somebody else's perspective, somebody who may not be the same thing we are. So if you're comfortable, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your sexuality and your gender experience?
Sure, absolutely. So, to be perfectly honest, most of the time in my day-to-day life, I don't really get into it very deeply. Not so much that I'm not open, it's just it turns into a long discussion. I most often simplify and say I'm bisexual, but I really identify as pansexual. Gender and I have a very loose, if at all, relationship. And the same thing goes with my personal gender identity. I actually struggled with a lot of internalized misogyny growing up due to my situation, and I've recently come to be more comfortable with more feminine aspects of my personality and aesthetic and things like that, but I still don't feel strongly attached to any gender. So I would say to be simple, I'll just say gender queer. And I have to say that Changeling has been different from me compared to other World of Darkness games, and even like D&D or Pathfinder, which D&D is historically really ghastly about that, whereas like Pathfinder is got a queer development team and they've been more conscientious in development, but they haven't introduced a genderqueer character until very recently. Whereas like Changeling, they never came out and said it, but you have this whole thing where you're mortal seeming and your Fey life can be different genders and it can change over time and through reincarnations. And that really spoke to me in a way that a game really hadn't in the past.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience with Changeling, and one thing you mentioned that made me think about a major Changeling dynamic. You talked about growing up and dealing with internalized misogyny. Something that really has always spoken to me about Changeling and the queer experience is Chrysalis, which on its surface, I feel like Chrysalis looks a lot like First Change, looks a lot like Embrace, looks a lot like Awakening. But the difference is with Changeling, it changes your whole identity. Sure, you become a werewolf with First Change, you become a vampire with Embrace, but it doesn't change who you always were before. It doesn't actually alter, your community and your self-identity that much, and certainly with Awakening, it really doesn't. Sometimes you aren't even aware anything's changed at all. You're just you do things intuitively. But with Changeling, it's this whole realization moment, and reintegrating a completely different self-identity than you ever had that you can lose, and you have this weird toxic relationship with, maybe, that eventually becomes more healthy. Occasionally you're a lucky character and you don't have a toxic relationship with it, but everybody's got banality. It's kind of core to the game. And I found I had very similar dynamics where I finally came out and I finally acknowledged who I was. And then I had like this whole group of friends that weren't queer. Now these new people that I didn't know nearly as long, who I had this thing in common with, and it took me a long time to bring those two things together and overlap them. And I know a lot of people that don't even try. They just like cast the old life aside and go into the new life, or they stay hidden. And so that to me seems very similar. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about how you experience that, and if you see similar parallels between your life and Changeling.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that you're right that, you know, coming out and chrysalis, like there is this point where you're like, oh, there is more to me than, I maybe knew at some level, but I never really admitted or had to face in this way before. And now I have to make a choice of what this means in my life going forward and my relationships around me. And integration is difficult. That's part of why I said that I often don't really go into depth about it. I don't consider myself closeted. It's just difficult to force it into conversation. Like, oh, yes, I've been with men and women, but I also like that's not my identity as far as my sexuality. But the integration is difficult. There definitely is this moment when you're coming out or during your chrysalis where you have to recognize that this is a turning point and you have decisions to make about your life. Like, are you going to try to share this with everyone from your past life right away or not at all? And there's all this kind of juggling. And then also your understanding is so small at that moment too, and it continues to develop and change over time. And whether or not you continue to include people in those changes is a different thing. Like when I first came out, I was very excited to find a community that embraced me, and I was very interested in sharing it with, my past. And I told my friends from my previous life, and I talked to my parents. But then as things became more nuanced and complicated, I became less vocal about it. And I can see in Changeling where, it may seem like at a surface level, oh, I am something more, and this is very exciting and very fantastic, and it'll bring great things to me and my family. But then as you get further into what it means to be Changeling, the dangers that are inherent in it, and the fact that, yes, you are still the same person that was a part of your family, growing up, but you're also, separate from them, and you have a different experience that they're never going to quite understand anymore from this point forward, like not inherently understand. And that sort of development I can see in the game, definitely.
I think we all know those people who've either like completely wrapped themselves up in their assumed identity, the identity that's put upon them by society, and then the flip side of that, the people who disappear into the we have a term that some of the listeners may not be familiar with, the gato, the queer world, basically, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't really come back out again. And in Changeling, you can see that kind of dichotomy pretty strongly amplified to the nth degree because it's a World of Darkness game, and they always do that. I also was always a little bit sad that in Changeling, gender is never like explicitly gender conflict is never explicitly addressed in any of the core materials that I've looked at, because in the course of trying to explain the game to some of my friends, someone who is familiar with the Hmong community in Minnesota pointed out that in Hmong spirituality, it's assumed that through reincarnation, you're constantly alternating whether you are male or female from life to life. And that seems like a really fertile ground for a lot of interesting examination and conflict that most people don't bring to the game, which makes me kind of sad.
Yeah, I've always felt like the remembrance dynamic, if you take no remembrance or like one remembrance, I figure any of your memories are going to kind of be refiltered through your current experience. But if you have, three, four, five remembrance, I would think that would become a pretty pronounced dynamic because they never, the flip side of never really inspecting it is they also never come out and say, oh, facials tend to reincarnate in the same gender. They don't say that either, which, leaves that as very ripe territory. Even just an anthology story or two in some of the short anthologies that deal with that would be really interesting. But I've noticed, at least in the most recent anthology, while I did like a lot of it, it tended to be more concrete in its storytelling. And I think Changeling, around this issue and others, benefits from some more abstract storytelling.
It's interesting to hear your guys' perspective on it because part of what really excited me about Changeling is that having a fluctuating gender identity wasn't a thing, even though, at least to me, and maybe it's just because I identify as genderqueer, it seems so obvious in the game. I just feel like so often, especially like things are just now kind of, turning to be more accepting in the mainstream media, but I feel so often having incongruous, you know, gender identity is just so sensationalized. And I feel like World of Darkness historically sometimes falls victim to that, and it was kind of nice. The game was so open that it wasn't even worth like making a problem out of it, and it was this idea that there would be this community of other changelings that would recognize someone who's, mortal seeming and their Famian may not have the same gender, and they would just be like, oh yeah, that's normal, that's how life is. And that's what was appealing to me. So it's interesting, the different perspective.
Yeah, and I think this kind of goes back to something Simon and I talk about a lot in terms of our similar perspective. I think a lot of times we look at the World of Darkness and we dump a lot of that sensationalized previous, I'll say, problematic nature from the early stuff and sort of think about it in terms of, well, if everything worked the way we actually wanted it to, what would we want this to look like? And I think, what you talk about, oh, yeah, that's normal. Maybe your Mien and your, human form don't have the same gender. And that doesn't even get into, non-cis identity just in your human form. And you have that and go through that before you go through Chrysalis. And what does that look like? I think, those sorts of stories would be super tricky to tell and would need to be told by non-cis individuals. And that goes back to, when White Wolf originally did these games, a lot of these issues weren't high profile and they weren't handled with nuance. I think I'd really love to see some of this stuff done now, by people who've lived this. And I know at least one of the current writers slash developers for Changeling is queer from talking to them. I'm not going to mention names, so that gives me some hope that there's some potential there for stories to be told.
Yeah, I would really love to see that. I think there are other gaming systems more recently that have really like strongly made a space for gay, lesbian, sexual identities and stuff like that, but there really hasn't been a space in an RPG world for people with non-conforming gender identities. And I've played a lot of games over time, and I really think Changeling probably is the one that it's the most easily accessible already. There is, you're right, a lot of unexplored potential. It would be very awesome to see them explore that.
One of the things you mentioned earlier, just talking about other parallels, you talked about, not kind of getting into the complexity of, your identity with people all the time. And I thought about my experience, not so much as a gay man, but as someone who's poly. I have multiple long-term partners, and like at work, I'm out as gay because that is easy. That's especially,
Yeah,
where
I
I
totally
work. That's easy. I'm not really out as poly. A couple jobs ago, there were a few people that knew. Generally people I shared an office with, and only a few people that knew. In my current job, I haven't really talked with anyone about it. And it's not that I don't want them to know, it's that it's a professional context and I don't want to explain it. And in Changeling, I thought about that and I thought about enchantment and finding people who you can fold into your social context and make connections with normal humans and enchant them so they can be part of your whole life. But you have to choose that really carefully. Like, you can take a banal person and enchant them if you roll well enough, but it's not going to be a good time.
Hmm.
They're not going to react well.
Yeah.
So they're very similar parallels there in negotiating those dynamics.
Yeah, there are many times in my professional life where people have asked me, "What did you do this weekend?" And I've, responded like, "I went camping." And then they're like, "Tell me about that." And my pat response now, unless I have a really strong antipathy for somebody, is, "Do you really want to know?" And in the case of somebody saying yes, they usually only say yes once. And in the case of somebody I have a really strong dislike of, I figure the easiest way to get them to stop asking is to just dump on them, which is possibly a ravaging tactic in Changeling.
Oh, yeah, that really is. Well, and it's interesting the flip side. There was a dynamic I ran into recently, and it made me kind of think about Changeling. I was at a teamwork retreat a few weeks ago, and in addition to being poly, I'm also in a DS relationship, and I have a chain collar. My office is super laid back, and they don't worry about dress code at all unless you're dealing directly with clients. So I work from home most of the time and I have the collar on. People see it, it's just chainmail. People generally don't ask about it. When I go and I work with people from my office in person, I leave it on. But when I go on site with clients, I take it off. And someone randomly made a joke about the chain, and my boss's boss looked at me and said, do you wear that when you go to schools? And I went, oh, no, I take it off. And I'm just thinking professionalism. And he looked at me and he said, one of our company, ethics is being your own true self. And he meant it. And I was like, am I having this conversation right now? And I was suddenly really uncomfortable. And later I thought, like,
Yeah.
what would it be like? You're walking around, you see someone, they don't have a fame yen, and then they, like, see you and you're
They
not
Hmm.
turn out to
expecting
be a
it. You
dreamer
suddenly,
or something, yeah.
yeah, you suddenly realize they have fey blood, but you didn't know it before, and so
Sure.
you don't see them, but they see you, and that would be kind of frightening, actually. But I've never seen that dynamic sort of played with in any of the books.
Yeah, that would be terrifying. At my old job, one of my coworkers was a burlesque dancer, and our boss found out about it, and our boss was super prudish and just a kind of terrible person who didn't think she was terrible. And she like started asking all these super invasive, really uncomfortable, totally inappropriate questions at work of this person. And like it was one of those moments where like I had to step in and be like, "Do you think this is appropriate?" And that's one of those things that should echo into Changeling pretty strongly sometimes.
I think too, what would be an interesting dynamic that I don't really see in Changeling, there's also the sense that like, how to explain this? When you're in a situation and you don't really have anyone else that has the same identity as you, gender, sexuality, or as a changeling or a human, and you find someone, I found that because we're a minority, there are sometimes people that you absolutely would not welcome into your life under any other circumstance. But because you share this minority status, they try to force themselves into being part of your group because you need to stick together. And then there's that whole balance between like, yes, like we should look out for each other and we should protect each other in this community where we are a minority and we are at risk, but also like, I do not want you to be a part of my everyday life because I get to choose who I spend time with, and you're not someone that I would normally do that with. And I think like that kind of comes up in some classic like fantasy D&D parties, like just throw them together and stuff. But I see that less in Changeling, at least from my experience. And I feel like I've experienced that, like at least personally, as a queer person in situations like work or volunteer where someone recognizes me, but they may be very rude and abrasive or dominating of a situation, and I would like to disassociate myself with that. And it's a hard balance to figure that out.
Yeah, that's the either the bad ally situation or the queer person who is not a good advocate or diplomat towards straight people. That is the person I am, and I recognize that, and I try to stay as far away from like discussing political activist activities with straight people that I haven't already felt out, because I don't have a ton of patience for explaining what I think are basic concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And in Changeling, at least, like that makes a really interesting space because the Enchanted and the Canane, I feel like they never got enough room in the game as they really should have, because they're humans who, for one reason or another, can see into this experience and share it in some degree, and they're immune to banality more or less. They would
Mm-hmm.
make great advocates for the spirit people in the game, but it never really gets used much.
Yeah, it doesn't. And I think that's unfortunate because I think what would be really interesting with the Canane is okay, they're immune to banality in terms of banality doesn't hurt them the way it hurts changelings. But at the same time, they have a banality rating. They can still pick up banality. I would think they would have banality triggers just like anyone else. It's just the act of gaining it doesn't have the same impact on them. And you could very easily get into some of the same dynamics of like, I'm an ally, I'm so pro you, I want everything that's great for you, but why can't you conform to my vision of what you're supposed to be? And I could see the Canane very easily like slipping into that as they get a little more banal.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of meaty potential there. The other flip side of that, in talking about, oh, hey, you're this person from this community, and we need to, get together and we need to work on this thing that is of mutual interest, but oh my God, we have nothing else in common. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
a lot in Changeling that resonates with that in the court divide and in the divide between the she and the commoners. This whole idea that we are the she, we know the way things are supposed to be, the way it's always been, and we bring all this glamour and all this, idealism. You need to be exactly like us. And then these, we'll say, more progressive, commoner changelings. I mean, there are certainly commoner changelings that do align with the she, or I'll say more Arcadian she, to use C20 terminology. And there's this very strong division between them. And what does it mean to be Fae? There's a constant debate in the broader queer community, and I'd say little versions of that debate that I've seen experienced in the gay male community, but I've seen it among lesbians. I've seen it among I'll say non-cis folks. I hate to say trans because that term doesn't necessarily encompass everyone who isn't cis. And I've seen very similar debates, and I don't feel as comfortable speaking to the specifics of the ones other than the gay male ones, but they're definitely there. And so I think there's a really interesting parallel lens to inspect in that whole dynamic.
There's also the divide between the different political affiliations outside of the Cathane in the opposed, sometimes usually opposed, goals of the Cathane and the Nunahi, or the Cathane and the Menahune, or the Cathane and the Sien, and that also did not get nearly enough exploration for my taste, but it's a good territory to go into if you can do it in a respectful way that doesn't necessarily center, well, my own experience because I'm white. Like being able to say, I may not succeed at doing this, and I have to open with, I may not succeed at telling this story.
Yeah, yeah, and that's such a weird place to be. And there are so many things written in the queer community about, yes, okay, I'm a gay man, but I'm not a white gay man, and I don't feel welcome, and I personally am a white gay man. So I read those stories and I try to, be present with them, but I can't speak to that experience in the same way that when I look at Changeling and I look at the Nunnehi, I look at Ishu and the Menehune, and I can't speak to that experience. I don't feel like I can fix what's wrong with their design and do it in any sort of way that's going to be any more true than what was done. But I want that story to be told, and that sense of, okay, we're here, but are we really welcome? That to me speaks so much to we're here and our cultures are still living and worshiping us, but we don't have access to the dreaming. That is such a strong parallel to non-white queer experience in the way I've seen it explained.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I am white, but I grew up in a community that is mostly minority. It's actually mostly Hispanic immigrant. So I feel like I'm maybe a little bit more sensitive, but I know that I don't understand what that experience is like. I would love to see that intersectionality explored a lot more in the game. I haven't read C20 yet. Would you say that I know that their treatment of the non-Arcadian Fae is better, but do you feel like they ever call out that intersectionality?
They really don't. I actually don't know. Would I say that it's better? There are a couple things they definitely did better. There are a couple things I actually like even less. I would say on the whole, they maintained the status quo, which, to be totally honest, I've tried to find some gaming communities around Changeling that aren't white, just to get a sense of how do players experience the game. They kind of aren't out there. I've seen a handful of non-white Changeling players on threads and feeds, but they're pretty rare. And I think some of that is the framing of the game isn't necessarily always welcoming. And the other thing that I find interesting is the non-white Changeling players that I have found tend to not be in white dominated cultures. They tend to be, oh, I live in Central or South America and I love Changeling. Oh, I live in Istanbul and I love Changeling. And I think that experience is probably a little different. And that sense of, does this game make a space for me? The need for that is a little different. But that's about as far into that as I can comment. But yeah, I'd say C20 on the whole didn't do any better or worse than the previous edition.
Erika knows I've been trying to get some of our mutual friends who may not be white into our game, and they're just not interested in Changeling. It's something about the way it's structured just hasn't been good for them. And I can make a lot of assumptions about that, but I think just reporting that fact is as far as I should go.
Yeah, I feel similarly about that. I mean, the parallel to non-white experience in the queer community specifically jumps out at me, but I don't really feel comfortable navigating that in more nuance because I will be stumbling blindly through that, and I know that. So,
One of the things that really spoke to me on my first reading of the old Changeling Second Edition book was that this is fundamentally the story of the tension between being this thing that you think is amazing and you love being this thing, and then on the other side you've got maybe your family, maybe your teachers, who have seen hints of this, or maybe all of it, and either don't understand it and they think they're being benign, but they're actually being harmful with their interest or their support, or they are actively opposed to this thing you are. And Victor and I both have talked a little bit about this from our own perspectives. We were hoping that Erika would be able to talk about this from your angle a little bit.
I would say that you're right. There is a parallel between changeling in the queer experience as far as really loving yourself and being excited to share it with people and explore it more. And then the people that were in your life before your chrysalis slash coming out, reacting it to different degrees. And then also like finding other people that want to celebrate with you who may also have recently discovered themselves or have known for a while and enjoy mentoring other people and stuff like that. I accidentally, when I went to college and I really started to explore my identity, I just so happened to just make friends with pretty much everyone that was in our alliance. I didn't go to a meeting. I just was friends with all these people, and they said, "Let's go to an alliance meeting." I was like, "Oh, this is everyone I know on this campus, pretty much in the small room." They were really supportive and encouraging, and we talked about all kinds of things, and it was a really great environment for us. And it was like we called it our college family, like, and we still refer to it that way, some of us. But then as far as like going back home, a lot of my friends that I had in high school, when I came home and I tried to talk to them about, not even just my experience with coming out, but just like the kind of media and jokes and stories that me and my new friends shared, where they just really connected with me on a deep personal level. They just seemed really bewildered and lost, um, and many kind of drifted away. And I feel like that would be that's a very similar dynamic, I would say, that a changeling would have, trying to, even just if you don't want to share that you have this other life, but just kind of like put a little bit of it out there, saying like, oh, I was just hanging out with my other friend who's also weird and prone to flights of fancy and stuff. And people are just like, oh, okay. And, a little concerned that there's someone out there that's encouraging that behavior in you and stuff like that. So I think that it's totally, it's there for sure in the kiss.
Well, and that's interesting. It makes me think about something from Dark Ages Fae. In modern changeling, banality tends to be its own standalone thing. If something banal happens, if you're around banality, it impacts you. But there isn't so much a banality dynamic just around being seen by someone who's banal. It's the presence to them that impacts you. Whereas in Dark Ages Fae, if you do something overtly magical, if you have a greater feature and a mortal sees you, you risk echoes, which is kind of the banality dynamic. And, thinking golden rule, I'm always thinking about ways to do tiny tweaks to make changeling resonate with particular themes. If you wanted to explore this, there's something to be said for, it's not that humans don't see chimerical reality, it's that humans convince themselves chimerical reality isn't there. Maybe they
Mm-hmm.
do see it, but they don't acknowledge it. And if you do, you know, if you're a little too outlandish, sure, there's the whole myth's impact on the mortal, and there are rules for that. But bringing some of that banality just at their rejection, their need to more overtly reject, and have that be a banality trigger for witness changelings, I think that brings in some interesting dynamics that does resonate with the danger of being seen that queer people experience. I mean, there are all sorts of things that queer people have done so we can recognize each other. Hanky codes and particular styles of clothing and, all of these other almost tells we give each other. And it's you don't tell straight people. Like, you don't tell cis people, you don't tell straight people. And it's weird. We have my gaming group is almost all gay guys, and we have one straight friend. And he loves telling this story about how he'd been playing with us for months, and then he realized we were all gay guys, and it was a big revelation for him. And every once in a while, some little artifact of gay culture will come up in our games, and we're all just talking in the language we know with each other. And he's like, wait, you just said a thing, didn't make any sense. What does that mean? We're like, sometimes we tell him, sometimes we look at him and like, do you really want to know why that guy has bands tattooed on his arm and it matters? um, And it's a weird dynamic, and he's safe, but if someone else really sees you, it can be very intimidating. So yeah, I think there's potential to look back at Dark Ages Fae for inspiration along those lines.
In our game, we've been using a hybrid where each permanent point of banality gives you a new echo, which is a further banality trigger kind of a thing. And I've been kind of toying with the idea of trying to explain how a temporary banality point works. And I think I finally hit on the metaphor I like for that, where a temporary banality point refers to a chill. It's not something that actually hurts you. It's something that makes you just a little bit numb, whether that's with fear or rejection or something else. And a lot of the times, for me anyway, I have this experience where something happens and it's chilling. And I remember reading about, it was a furry convention, I think, in maybe Chicago, it might not have been, that got chlorine gas bombed and nobody got
Yeah,
hurt.
that was
But
Chicago.
Yeah, that was
that was one of
Midwest Fur Fest.
that was one of those things where that fits that metaphor really well for me because I'm not a furry, but I've got so many friends who are a part of that community that it was instantly a oh god, what just happened? I can't feel that right now kind of thing.
Yeah, and I pass, I would say. I am pansexual, I'm genderqueer, but I present as female mostly because I'm lazy. And my partner is a man at this time, so people don't see me for who I am as far as my queer identity most of the time. And I don't often have problems at work, but I have a few colleagues that occasionally will say something that is a microaggression, especially towards, trans or gender queer people. And there's this moment where I just have to like take it because we're in a staff meeting or something, and I have to continue to sit there and let it be okay because it can't cause a scene in this professional setting. And now's not the time to, make someone really question the way that they talk about, other gender in general and how it can be harmful to say some sort of things that they're saying. And yeah, that I would say that's out there for sure in the game.
One of the things that I've experienced as a gay man that I actually didn't find an analog for in Changeling, and I kind of wish was there, was when I was in college. I was like, I am a gay man. I am attracted to men. Blah blah blah. And I was not woke to trans issues at the time. And I met someone kind of in passing who was trans masculine, and they disclosed that to me. And it was a really odd moment for me because it was kind of a watershed going backwards where I had this moment with this person and I looked back on the things I had done and said and realized that no, this is part of my identity too, and I need to, one, not be terrible in the future, and two, I need to like realize that this whole gender thing, it doesn't mean what I think it means, and I need to be okay with that. And I kind of wish Changeling had a thing where you've had your chrysalis, you've had your coming out, and then you have another one, and then you have another one.
So this is interesting because I actually think it does now in C20. I hadn't thought about it in these terms until you told that story, but C20 creates antithesis and I forget what the term is for your one most unique way to gain glamour and
Reverie. Or, no, revelry.
revelry. Revelry. Maybe I'm thinking about what I wish the system was or what I want to golden rule it as. Revelry is tied to your kith. I'm thinking, if you add something more personal, sort of like with knockers, I guess that is still tied to kith. But if you took revelry a step farther, like what is personally glamorous to you, but then you also have things that are very unique banality triggers. And I think if you take the system a little farther than it's written in C20, I think the foundation's there. You need to maybe take it a step farther in flexibility and uniqueness for each character. The dynamics that you just described emerge. Like, I'm a slua. I am XYZ, and that is glamorous to me, and this has been banal to me. You are a knocker. You are, ABC. And I can say a thing that literally fills me with glamour that's a banality trigger for you. And the game didn't used to have that. And I don't know that it's designed in C20 specifically in the context we're talking about. I don't know if that's totally the intent, but I think the intent is very adjacent to what we're talking about. I think you can absolutely use that system, and it just takes a little bit of zhuzhing to get to kind of what you just described.
I always felt like Changeling was the sort of game, like it sets itself up that most of the time you're starting the game like shortly after your chrysalis, so you're still very new to the community and you're still learning stuff, unless you're with a group that's been playing for a while and you're more seasoned and experienced. And I feel like you kind of do get that. Just the further and deeper you go into it, the more your understanding of what it means to be a changeling and your identity as a changeling, uh, expands and evolves over time.
And it's interesting as it evolves. One thing I was thinking about when you talked about being in an office environment and experiencing a microaggression and just having to swallow it in that moment, where it's like, and I've heard the description of what really hurts about microaggressions isn't the scope of the wrong, it's that you experience that same wrong over and over and over and over and over again, and it's so adjacent to your identity. And that's really banality triggers. That's it's right there, especially in the new system. I know, Erika, you said you haven't read, C20. They really sort of outline more specifically events your character experiences that if it happens, you have to roll to avoid gaining temporary banality. And it can vary from character to character. It's much more personalized. And that's basically what that becomes. Like, that it's kind of one of the best descriptions of microaggressions I've ever seen. Where, like, if you experience that trigger once in your life, or once every few months, maybe it's not the end of the world. But if you're in an environment where you're experiencing that daily, it will literally undo you.
My other experience too with microaggression, I would say that the part that always eats at me afterwards is not so much what was said, but just how everyone else just accepted it and it didn't affect them at all. And I think that would also, play into Changeling very well, whereas this thing is deeply hurts you, the very core of you, whereas like everyone else just walks around and it's no big deal, just, goes right past them.
Yeah, and I think I like that. I almost kind of want to build that into how I use banality triggers. And I think I could see a system where if as a changeling you have a banality trigger and you're the only one to roll it and you're surrounded by changelings, the difficulty to avoid the banality goes up. Because I think that also really strongly correlates to being, the only bi person in a room full of gays and or lesbians, the only trans person at the LGB, and okay, the T is on the invite, but not really campus group, and we've all been to that group. I think that creates a very parallel and very changeling, tragic dynamic around that. And that's one of those things I'd have to be very careful to make sure everyone in my game was okay with me using that system. Because I could see players are like, no, I roleplay to have fun.
Yeah, that would be one of those things that would be fun to explore just because you're really interested in delving into like your character development and what would this mean for my character if you're like really into that depth exploration. But if you're just there to have a good time, that could be soul sucking for sure.
Well, and this is territory.
It's a banality trigger.
It's a banality trigger. This is one of those. I find Changeling to be really interesting because so many players say, "Oh, it's the light, fluffy game," and then there are players who are like, "No, it's the darkest game. It's worse than Wraith." and I tend to lean towards the latter. In Wraith, they devote so much word count to here's how you negotiate your players' boundaries, because if you're going to play this game, you have to do this. And I feel if you really play Changeling for all of the social dynamics, especially the dynamics we're talking about here in this queer context, that stuff becomes at least as important in Changeling as it is in Wraith.
Here is a tale of the trees and the wood. They were never that pleased on the land where they stood. So they upped and they walked off as far as they could, till they felt the sunshine on their branches. And there they did stand, and there they did stay, till there came a young boy who was running away from a mad world, a bad world, a world of decay, and its comfort that he sought in their branches. It's not easy to hide when your heart's on full view. Oh, tonight, cruel world, be forgiving. Oh, for once in my life, I am living. So, in Changeling, there's the idea of the freehold as a safe space for changelings, and the queer communities have similar spaces in that we have the gay bars, we have a few lesbian bars, I wish we had more, and we have performance spaces, which overlaps kind of nicely with certain types of freeholds you might have. And the thing I've always found really interesting about that dynamic surrounding freeholds is what happens when an unenchanted human finds one. What do they do? And real recently in the city that I live in, there was a gay sex club, and the city that I live in has a particularly stupid history with anything even vaguely resembling an adult interest. And since the 70s, bathhouses have been illegal in this state. Well, not this state, but the cities. So this sex club opened a while back, and it was an underground thing. It was below the radar, and another gay man found out about it from another city, another state even, and was outraged that this thing existed, and just started a campaign to get it shut down. He contacted the health board, he contacted city officials, and eventually he prevailed because of fire code violations, I think. And I kind of knew tangentially about this because I live here and I'm plugged into a lot of the communities who liked that space and used it. And even the ones who didn't, use it were still like, yeah, this is a thing that probably should exist. And this guy, finding out about this space, was done up in a City Pages article a while back, and I read it, and having all that information and history and narrative there, it suddenly clicked for me that this was the story of an autumn person, or possibly a Dauntain, finding a freehold. This is what happens to freeholds when people who are particularly banal find out about them. But of course, there are other queer spaces in the area, but it was one of those lightning strike moments for me, finding this story and then looking at it from a changeling sort of lens.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that I just thought of is there's another parallel. Several years ago, I was talking with some friends about sort of curated queer sexual spaces and how a lot of, I'll say, more proper members of especially the gay community, these spaces aren't exclusively gay, but they tend to more often than not be gay male or pansexual are the two sort of identities that they tend to be most strongly associated with. And you'll get the handful of people that want push for respectability, who I think of as a strong corollary to Autumn People or the Undone, who are written out a little more to make up that space in C20. But an interesting thing happens if you close those spaces. The people that go to those spaces, that seek those sexual experiences, don't just go, oh, well, that's cool, I'll stay at home. That's where you get into people cruising parks. And sometimes parks and spaces that are unsettlingly close to children. Not that they want to be there, but that, hey, this is the place I can go to get this interaction. There are several places in Chicago that are known for this, not so much close to children, thankfully, but those dynamics do happen. Oh, there's a park. If I go there late at night, there are restrooms that are discreet that I can cruise, that I can have this interaction with. And as you close these spaces off, you get more and more and more activity in those sorts of spaces. And in Changeling, if you were to go through a city and close off freeholds, well, I'm not getting glamour from the balefire anymore. Time to go ravage, 'cause I'm hungry. You get a very similar dynamic that emerges when you really stop and think about it. I mean, there are some strong similarities and very unsettling stories to be told there. Stories that I would not tell with straight players, if I'm going to be totally honest.
Right, and this circles back to a conversation I think we had a while ago where we were talking about the idea of having micro springs, the idea that a particular kith or a particular mindset might view a societal change as being particularly glamorous, while others may not. And the passage and legalization of gay marriage in this country would be something that gay boggans would draw significant solace and probably glamour from, while gay satyrs would shrivel on the vine at the idea, by and large.
Yeah, although on the flip side of that, I think, and this gets into some weird, deep changeling story that can be hard to pull out because they deal with it, but never that well. There's this theme going back all the way in Changeling about the Fae that survive are the Fae that adapt and wrap themselves up in a new form. It goes all the way back to Graceful Wicked Masks. You look at queer society now, you get this, oh, okay, well, we're getting married, and now we're making open marriages more normative, and open relationships, and becoming part of this societal norm, but transforming it instead. I think there's also a story there about this microspring that the boggans immediately just cleave to and go, yes, hearth and home and family, and the sort of early struggle that happened in the middle of that transition in our society, and then jump forward and look at the satyrs who have done that transformation that is so critical, so central to, Fae existence, going back to their first emerging from the wild, and how it's different between, the satyrs that have done this transition and the boggans that have gone, oh, cool, yeah, I can be part of that, and the boggans who are traditionalists and go, no, that's not okay, and the satyrs who aren't willing to make that transition. You get into some really messy social dynamics that I think would be fascinating to explore.
And that gets into the idea of your character as a queer character in the game, and how some of these themes overlap themselves in a kind of recursive loop when you go in that direction. In the past, I've played characters who, due to the reincarnation thing in Changeling, alternated genders, because I thought that was an interesting territory to explore. And in the case of one of them, it was just this thing that happened, and we never had enough development in any of those games to have characters who knew the previous incarnation of that character meet the new incarnation of that character, but that would have been fun.
I am hoping to explore that in our current chronicle, just because it's more of a long form game and that might come up. But currently, I'm playing a character whose Thamian is female, but their mortal Thamian is male. And exploring that, not really too much as far as like the other characters, just because the other characters in the game are all changelings, and so they all seem to be very open and welcoming to this idea. However, it will be interesting to see if that ever comes up in a sort of mortal relationship. Unfortunately, my character is is abrasive to people for a lot of reasons, so that hasn't come up yet. But it's definitely it's a fun exploration. It's been my first gender queer character, I think, like I'm pretty sure it's my first genderqueer character I've played. And if not, it's the first I've done in a long time. And since I've really confronted my own gender identity, and it's been interesting. I've explored so many other of my relationships with my identity, especially like my pansexuality in character, but not my gender before. So it's been fun to get in touch with that in a game.
So that just made me think of something that I kind of want your feedback on. And this is one of those things where I see a parallel, but it's not in the scope of my personal experience. I see so many of my trans friends talk about the process of transitioning. I had one friend where the first time that they went out in makeup was a huge deal, and it was a big build up, and it was a massive moment for them. And one thing that I think would be interesting to explore in Changeling, there's not a good system for it now, but like, what would you think about building a system whereby you could find ways to acceptably express your fei mian in mortal form, and that the act of doing that gave you some defense against banality triggers? If you could kind of push that out and be more closely integrate your mortal and fey experience and mitigate some of that banality bedlam pendulum act that happens, because it seems like there's meat there that's not explored.
Man, I would love that. I historically play a lot of werewolf, and that's something that I've always wanted. Like, oh, wouldn't it be cool to just be a little more animalistic in this moment? And I think Changeling definitely lends itself more to bending that a little bit. There's more flexibility, and there is like a certain armor and relief and excitement to be able to just do even just a little tiny thing that is more in line with your identity. Like I one of my experiences really coming to terms with my gender identity was I was part of a drag show, and I was a host, and I had chosen to present full mask at the time, and I wore a binder for the first time. It was exhilarating to do that. And I can remember spending a lot of time just before and after the show when I wasn't on stage just staring at myself in a mirror. And then, like, even though I was just borrowing a binder from a friend who was a similar size to me, I wore it for like several days after the show just because I was enjoying this new ability to bring part of my internal experience and put it out there. And because I was in a really accepting community within our alliance at my school, but also my school is super progressive, it never turned into a dangerous, aggressive situation. It was just accepted. And that was so fulfilling in a way that is really difficult to articulate.
I think you've articulated that beautifully, actually. I mean, to me at least, all of that experience makes a lot of sense and maps to Changeling very well.
I would really enjoy for a character to be more sly, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, but also like for it to benefit them in some way to bring it out there. I think, going back to what we were talking about before about loving your queerness, part of that for me has always been just like putting it out there into spaces, that are more cis het normative and just being out there with it. And like it brings its own magic to the situation and stuff. And I think there's a lot of beauty in that. And I would love to see Changeling have a sort of dynamic where you're not necessarily coming right out in front of mortals, but you're just leaving a bit of magic everywhere you go. I would love that to have to be less of a dangerous situation for a changeling and be more of like a way of enriching a mortal's world.
There was one thing moving forward with our homebrew game that I was trying to figure out how to express and incorporate, and in Vanilla Changeling, there's calling on the weird, invoking the weird, where you suck your fey seeming into reality, and you just go full bore into what it is you think you are, and fuck what everybody else thinks about it until the consequences hit. And I wanted to expand on that idea a little bit, and I ended up drawing pretty heavily on my experience as a gay man, because it's one of those things where it's not exactly like you don't always go full pride, full queer. There are a lot of little tells we do for each other, and sometimes we do those tells at other people who aren't necessarily in the know. And one of the things I was trying to develop was this idea of being able to, in the gay community, we would call it cruise, where you're giving a tell and you're trying to get one back. And in Changeling, I feel like there's a really good space there for both the dynamic where you are revealing a little bit and hoping to get some back, and also the dynamic where you're going up to, air quotes, a normal person, and you are imposing a little bit of what you think you are on them. And so it's hard to come up with a metaphor for people who aren't in the know there, but the idea is, when people are sort of checking each other out and they do that nod thing where they look you up and down, I feel like that's the one most people get.
Yes.
And,
oh, yes.
And in Changeling, I think there's a space there for clearing the mists a little bit, where you don't necessarily invoke the weird, but you do make a roll and you reveal maybe part of your mien. Like, you might have striking eyes, or you might have stupid elf ears, or you might have an animal feature, and you just pull that little bit of it through the mists for anybody who might be looking at that moment to see. And it doesn't necessarily invoke banality, unless, the person you're doing it to has a extremely negative reaction. But it's a way of, forcing them to peek a little bit. And I feel like that gets to that dynamic you both were talking about, where it would be neat if there was a way to leave a little magic around for people to find.
Yeah, I really like that. Some of that gets into, you need to tweak some other things, like the fact that changelings always recognize each other. I've never really loved that. I feel like if you're walking through the mall, if you meet someone at work in a business context and they're a changeling, you should have a chance to notice, but you shouldn't notice automatically because they're wrapped up in their trying to engage with, banal reality. I think if you played the game that way, where if you meet someone at a festival in a social setting, you're going to recognize them. But banality makes it difficult. It requires a kenning roll to notice, which gets into, DAR dynamics, etc. But I think if you worked that as the normal seeing other miens, that system you're just talking about suddenly makes a lot more sense and opens a lot of interesting social dynamics.
And wouldn't that be great too if it also operated in that sense where you think you're completely alone and isolated in your experience, and you are working maybe it's at work or maybe it's at school, and there's this person that is in that space as well, and maybe you talk quite a bit, and maybe you don't really at all, and you just exchange glances. And the more time you spend in their presence, the more all of a sudden there's just you roll your success roll and you're like, oh my God, you're one of us. Because I don't know about you, but for me, I've had situations where it's just been, I thought that I was the only queer person in a situation, and then even though I've interacted with this person every day, maybe at some point I started to get a suspicion, and then all of a sudden it just suddenly clicks. I'm like, oh, okay, we are the same. This is good. It's not just me anymore. And suddenly you're able to collaborate and speak more openly, and
I could see that also making it possible to resist banality in a situation. Like if your character has a job they have to maintain, and it's kind of a banal job, but you need to pay the bills. A lot of role-playing games overlook that stuff, but sometimes if you're doing a more introspective game, you build that in, and then you have that one other changeling that's doing the same thing. Each of you make it easier for the other to survive. I think there's a lot of fun potential there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
On the flip, there's also the hiding dynamic gets a lot more interesting there. I don't know if we've all had this experience, but I've had coworkers who we've done the nod, and we recognize each other. And then you start to see how they're moving in and out of social context. The easiest example is I have had a coworker in the past who was very obviously gay to me, but not everyone. And it was interesting watching his performance of his identity change based on context, because there's a thing, it's a little bit overplayed and a little bit simplified, I think, for straight understanding, but there's gay voice. There's this thing we do. We don't all do it, and we don't all do it all the time, but there's a definite identifiable quality to a gay man's voice a lot of the time. And this coworker, his gay voice was a switch. You could hear it 1 minute talking to one person, and then talking to a customer, it was totally gone. And watching that happen, on the one hand, it was really impressive, and then on the other hand, you start to reflect on how that was a learned skill and how it was closely tied to his survival growing up. And it was chilling again. It may have been a banality trigger for me to watch that.
Yes. I had this really interesting experience. I mentioned earlier talking about I had this huge social context that was not queer, and then I came out. I came out a little late. Sort of, my real coming out into the community was kind of late. And I had this conversation with one of my straight friends, and, my performance of my gayness came up. And he's like, before you did this, you didn't read gay at all. Like, some of my friends knew, almost all friends who were not entirely straight themselves, but my straight friends did not. They had no idea. And then he was like, as soon as you started, going to the LGBT center, I made this switch in my life where I suddenly decided I'm going to be involved in the community. My friends knew before that, but I didn't engage with the culture. And as soon as I made that switch, he was like, all of these things changed about your behavior. And it's not, it wasn't a problem, but it confused him. And I was completely unaware of it. And being aware that I have some of gay voice now, it's there, and it's not a thing I have to modulate or deal with. I work from home. I really don't have to go into that survival mode. But knowing that I clearly did for a large swath of my life is a thing that's weird for me when I contemplate it. It's strange.
I find myself in an opposite position. Like I said, I went to school where I just so happened to make friends with the GLPD community right away. And also, like, it was a very small, very liberal progressive school, but the people that went to our alliance meetings took up the main, like, the prime seats in the cafeteria. Like, they were very vocal on campus and were involved in a lot of different activities and stuff, and essentially, like, they were leaders in their own rights. So it was a bubble for certain. And at the time in that bubble, I was very obvious to everyone around me, but then I've been outside of that bubble for so long now and in a more normal cishet dominant community where a lot of the tells that I used to have are just not there anymore. And so, like, in that way, like, to be frank, I'm just absorbing banality of being outside of my bubble, and it's difficult, the transition that I've made, because I didn't used to feel like, bi erasure or anything like that, even when I was female presenting and currently dating a man. But it's been so long, and because I don't have enough other queer people surrounding me in my day-to-day professional life, that there's no buffer there to kind of like to reinforce my identity, I guess.
And that, I think, speaks a lot to a dynamic that is a lot more interesting in C20. One of the things I love the most about C20 is in old Changeling, you went from Childer to Wilder to Grump to Undone. Maybe not like never reincarnated Undone, but like you're done. You're not a Changeling anymore. And it was this linear progression. And in C20, you can move between those seemings. You can be the 90-year-old man who's totally a child, and the grandfatherly figure from The Little Prince, and you're a childer, and a lot of what you described, you still very much have this identity. It strikes me a lot as like that transition into being a grump, but also the way you described it, I could very much see a later phase of your life, or someone who'd had that experience who finds themselves in that community again and shifting
Sure.
again and it feeling fluid and dynamic. And so I think that's something that's expressed a lot more elegantly in Changeling than it used to.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the same way that in Changeling that it's much easier for you to resist banality and to just be safe against the world when you're in numbers. I have the same experience where, like, I was in this community that, I mean, I went from that school. Also, I moved to Chicago into Boys Town too. So I kind of just continued the bubble for as long as possible until I came here for my job. And I think you are absolutely right. If I were to shift back into employment or even just volunteering more in the GLB community than I have been able to, that it would, like, I would feel more of the erasure of my identity in my day-to-day life, and I would feel more empowered and I would feel more like myself.
I think that's actually a really good place for us to sort of wrap up. We've hit a bunch of topics, and there are others we could talk about, but the episodes can only go on for so long. I'd like to really thank Erika for coming and talking with us. You brought a lot of dynamic to this conversation, and we really appreciate you being here. I'd also like to thank, as always, Simon, my co-host. He really makes the show come together for me, and I really appreciate everyone who's listening. This is the first opportunity we've really had to say anything since we got started, but I really appreciate all our listeners. We've been kind of blown away by the response. Most of the shows we put up until now were all recorded before we actually went live, so we haven't had a good chance to talk about that, but thank you very much. And that has been Walking Away from Arcadia.
The reading from this conversation was Little Jack Frost by Kate Rusby. The music from this episode was LSD by Mon Plaisir. Today's poorly explained echo. If the cobbler was impressed with the shoes the brownies left for him, he should have seen the ones they kept for themselves.